Hi, welcome to the 3D Pen Den. Recently I posted an introductory video about how to sculpt a lizard from Play-Doh and use that to form 3D pen print. Then you just take the Play-Doh out put a lid on him and finish him in any way you like. At this point you might be wondering, what about sculpture that doesn't have this convenient flat open bottom to peel the Play-Doh out? What if the shape is more like this guy? Then what? Well, I am glad you asked. We will be using Play-Doh again, even though the discussion of what clay is best for this is still ongoing. Some of the issues you may be looking to avoid are listed in the Introduction to Clay Forming video, so watch that one too before you go clay shopping. The link is in the description. Here is a bare pattern from the 3D Pen Den Etsy store. But you can also, of course, easily design your own critter. You want your plexiglass surface sprayed with matte acrylic finish on both sides. This is important because we will be using both sides of it. Think about it as making two-part mold. You want to cut the shape in half along the widest point, but avoid having the seam run in the middle of his face or any other complex areas. That would be too hard to clean up later. Also, consider making the pattern in such a way so there are no tight corners. That would make it difficult to fit your tools in them. You can always change the shape later, as needed. I will be working in relatively small increments, so first I'll just trace the head with the ears, which is super easy on a solid flat surface. Now it's time to sculpt, which is also relatively easy because the first two dimensions are already there in the drawing, and I'm just adding the third one, going up. The first and also the last step in every sculpting session will be excavating the plastic outline, because we'll need that to land on with the pen when we are ready to trace the third dimension. I am going to make the muzzle now, and since I have already covered the face part of the pattern with the clay, I will use this little muzzle part on the printout to size it. Here I'm looking for just a printed line to get the size right. And then I will attach it to the main face. Speaking of attaching it, I will have to decide where to put it. So I will divide the face in half, vertically and horizontally. And the horizontal division will be the eye level. So the muzzle will need to go below it. I like to actually make the eyes and the nose first, so I can try it on and plan what the face will look like at the sculpting stage, when it's still easy to change my mind about it. There's a separate video on eyes in the description if you need guidance on that. And noses are very similar to eyes. The first step in the tracing stage is also dividing it in the middle, vertically and horizontally. And note that I'm not really writing on the clay itself, but rather just stretching the plastic strands around it. and patting it down wherever the strand stays stretched in the air to make it conform to the dipped shapes. Once you have the two main divisions in place, it makes it possible to strategically attach everything else to it. And when I say strategically, I mean, for example, to leave openings for the eyes to go in, since we know now from the marks in the clay where that is likely to be. And then just keep going to further define the shape. And possibly edit out any strands that may be in the way of the nose, and then subdivide it into smaller units that will be possible to fill when the time comes. Time to add the next part. I will mark the shape of the neck on my head network and edit out the plastic out of the channel where the clay will meet. This is not strictly necessary, but it does help later with getting the clay out more easily. Okay, now for the next chunk of Play-Doh. I know what you're thinking. Hasn't she ever heard of throwing the strands over a found object or a tool? The problem with working over found objects or over tools is that it's never quite the right shape or size. I used to sometimes spend so much time looking for just the right thing that I thought I would have had it sculpted by now. How long the sculpting stage will take you will depend entirely on how fussy a sculptor you are. Here we'll need just pretty basic shape, but doing it this way gives you control over subtly convex and concave shapes, plane changes, and such things. The point is, it is completely customizable, which is what you should expect from an art medium. Mind you are sculpting just half of the neck on this side. My first bear had a neck that was way too thick once the back part was added. So watch that the parts that are supposed to be thin stay that way. I could keep going with the sculpt, but for the purposes of this video, let's trace this part. Again, start dividing it vertically and horizontally. And then wherever it makes sense. No particular rules. The shape itself will tell you where it wants to be divided next. The goal is to trace the curves and subdivide it into smallish chunks. Sometimes it is helpful to slightly lean on the strand with some tool, or in my case with my nail, at the landing point to stretch it tighter around the shape. But the plastic also tightens by itself a little as it cools, which helps. Next, I am going to add the fill. With the traditional methods, you would have to have way more dense network before you could do this. But because I still have the clay in there, it will support the fill in the shape of the clay core and also keep it from caving in with heat and gravity, because the clay will just catch the plastic. While the plastic is coming out of the pen hot and pliable, I can also optionally smoosh it slightly with a rubber tool or a finger guard to make it stick to the network better, partially smooth it, and make the network and the fill all one solid layer. Just don't be too rough with it. The clay is relatively soft. Normally, I would do the network and the fill in the same color, and the network would completely disappear in the fill. But for the purposes of this video, I thought the two colors will show better how the network and the fill integrate together. If you do choose to do this pre-smoothing step, move in small enough increments so you can smoosh each addition before it hardens. Mind you, this doesn't save you from smoothing with the melt tool, but it does make that step a bit faster. The parts of the network that are the major crossroads, where the plastic strands originate or meet, will have a lot of these raised plastic knots that kind of stick out and ruin the smooth line of the overall shape. So I will just put the plastic around them and not over them, as not to make the matters worse. And then eventually smooth them with a melt tool to the immediate surrounding area to achieve just one even layer of plastic. Like so. Smoothing tips could be a subject of a whole video, and which one I use depends mostly on the size and the shape of the project at hand. This is my current favorite tip for small projects, because it combines a small flat shape at the end with a larger round one on the side of it. So I can switch between the two as needed without using two separate melt tools. But more on that some other time. I am going to remove the pattern now and work on the other side of the plexiglass to get exact reverse image of the outline. Support the first half of the bear with some extra Play-Doh. The sprayed plexi is usually adhesive enough so that the first half of the bear stays on it until you are ready to remove it. But if you accidentally pop it off, just tape it back on with a piece of masking tape. Trace the head with the ears again. This pattern is pretty symmetrical, so in theory I could make the other side of the bear of the same pattern. But when the design isn't symmetrical, or if you deviate it in the outline slightly here and there, this way you will get the exact reverse image of the outline of what you just made, quickly and easily. That's why we sprayed both sides, remember? On the back side, I will give some bulk to the ears as well. Whenever you are making something that comes in twos, like 2 ears, it is helpful to start with a ball of clay, cut it in 2 exact halves to keep the 2 sides approximately the same size. reason why I'm doing this on the plexiglass and keeping the first half of the bear on is so I can monitor how the shape continues onto the other side. So it makes sense as a continuous piece of sculpture. I want to check, for example, how the shape continues through. Is the widest point of the head at the right height? Is the back of the skull big enough compared to the front side of the head? And if it's not, I can add some more clay before I get into too much cleanup. Monitoring the shape from all sides is an essential part of sculpting, so you will need to rotate the whole setup quite a bit. That's why I have it set up on a tile and not straight attached to my work table, so I can turn the tile around instead of running around the table. Or even better, if you have a Lazy Susan or a sculptor's turntable, it will make your life way easier. Not just for the sculpting stage, but for all 3D pen work. If it's too wobbly, support the setup with something, if needed, to keep everything stable. Again, start by dividing the shape vertically and horizontally. And keep going from the cross point this time to integrate the ears. And remember, if you make a line that you don't like, you can always edit it out and redo it. Divide the head and move on to the back of the body. Get into cleaning up the details, I will check the profile again. Is the butt at the right height in relationship to the tummy on the other side? Once I'm reasonably happy with it, I can smooth the Play-Doh as best as it will let me. It's not the most precise modeling compound on the planet, but some of the better ones are not as user-friendly for the 3D pen work, as I already mentioned in the intro video. The Play-Doh will drive you a bit nuts by how spongy and crackly it is, but it can be smoothed into reasonable finish by rubbing it with water. Don't overdo it, you don't want it sticky. And make sure you clean the landing line again. And let it all soak in and dry off a bit before you start with the pen tracing. Also, never touch the pen nozzle to the clay. It may clog it. Remember, you are just stretching the lines around the shape. You really need to throw just one line around the whole thing, and if the shape is too extreme to do the other line in one go, do it in two pieces, connecting to the first one. And then keep going. Note how much easier it is working with the pen on a turntable. See how much more I turn it while I'm working when I can? Since the pen is tied to one spot with the power cord, you do need the spot you are working on to come to the pen, not the other way around. Profile check before I'm going to put the fill in. I think I want to add some more divisions on his sides right here. The network is not dense enough yet to fill. Once I'm done filling and smoothing the second half, it's finally time to take both halves off and remove the Play-Doh. Most of the Play-Doh comes out quite easily. Except for some of the skinny parts, you may need some tools to get it out of there. And if there is a bit of residue here and there, you can dig it out with a big needle or just leave it in there. It won't hurt anything. Now, before I join the two halves together, I better put in the eyes. I will stuff a piece of Play-Doh just into the face area so I can finalize the eye placement. And then play with rotating the eyes until they look in the same direction. Once I'm happy with his expression, I will stabilize them with a bit of kneaded eraser because the Play-Doh is too non-stick to keep them reliably in place, and attach them with a pen. And then a melt tool to keep them in place. And repeat the same process for the nose. Now we can stick the halves together. First at strategic spots like the neck, at the armpits, top of the head and such, to make sure it all fits snugly together. We'll attach it all around. I just use the melt tool for this. There is so much extra plastic on the landing line that I feel it's unnecessary to add more with the pen, unless you have a gap somewhere. Once we have him all in one piece, It's time to make him stand. I am making the feet separately so I can balance him more easily. But you can also sculpt him already with shoes on when you make the halves. That's entirely optional. Either way, same process. Sculpt, trace, attach the bear at the appropriate moment, making sure he's balanced enough to stand well. Fill, smooth, and remove the clay. In my case, I will also have to make the soles of his feet. So that's an extra step you don't have to do if you sculpt him with his bare feet already in place. I want this part super flat and even, so he stands well. So I will iron this part, because you don't get any more flat and even than with ironing. Plus, it's way quicker than smoothing and sanding the soles of the feet. Speaking of sanding, I am planning to put sort of a fur texture on him all over, so I can get away with just minimal sanding. However, you do want to grind it a bit to get the overall shape smooth enough for the texture to go on evenly. Especially get the main seam under control so it doesn't show on the final shape. Now, I made this pattern strategically so I don't have to struggle with any tight corners that would be unreachable by the pen and other tools. But I do want him to keep his arms down a bit eventually. So I am going to shapeshift his arms downward. Before I do that, I will put a bit of the fur texture on his underarms and sides, because after the shapeshift, I won't be able to reach those areas anymore. More on the fur texture in a minute. Shapeshifting is a tricky step. A lot of people like to do it with flame. I prefer the control you get with a heat gun. That is not to say you can't ruin your piece with either one. Just with a flame you are likely to hurt it more. I protect the parts that don't need softening from the heat overflow with a wet rag. And then I just go for it, carefully. Heat it all around the shoulder here, and once it softens, stretch it downwards a bit. Sometimes it takes a few tries before you feel it's soft enough to give. And then just hold it there until it cools enough to stay that way. I am doing this before I put the final fur on the rest of him, because I might need to fix any mess that happens if the shapeshift causes any scars or bubbles that need mending. If there are issues, just add more plastic with the pen. Smooth. And sand, and it will look like nothing ever happened, except his pose improved. Almost done. Just planning the shape of my finish colors. I apply the fur finish with the pen using a slight stippling motion. Sort of like when the needle of a sewing machine bobs up and down. It creates sort of terry cloth texture that works well on furry critters. How high you lift the pen off the surface creates slightly different results, so the trick is to be as consistent with the application as you can. You may want to practice a bit on a scrap surface first, to make sure you like the texture before committing to it. You have other finishing options like heat engraving, for example, but let's leave that for a future video. Once you get to the ears, you will find there is still a gaping hole in him. So close it first with the pen, with a bit of crisscross network. And once it's cool enough not to cave in, put some fur straight over it. If the surface gets too soft and wobbly from working on the same area, work somewhere else for a while to give that area a chance to cool down and solidify again. And then just keep going. Until you have a bear. You can stop right here if you like, or you can optionally highlight the texture with acrylic ink in contrasting color to get the maximum effect from your texturing efforts. How to do that is explained in the recent beaded lizard video. So is this everything there is to know about this clay forming technique? Of course not. But let's leave that for a future video. Until then, go and make something.